Although we've looked at divine command theory in a very general sense repeatedly, we'll look at it in a bit more detail now. Now, as I mentioned numerous times, the definition of divine command theory is that moral principles are defined and justified in terms of divine will. That is, that what God says is good because he says so, and what God forbids is evil because he says so. And the reason why people should be moral, obey God, is because, well, God commands them, and they simply should obey God. Now, God is typically regarded as perfectly good, so one appeal would be that what he commands surely must be good. And God, being God, would seem to be universal, in his commands, impartial, they presumably apply to everyone, and overriding. Now, in terms of how morality would be enforced, at least in theory, it would be presumably by divine agents. Either, just God himself makes it happen, with divine reward, heaven, divine punishment, hell, or however it works, or there might be other agents involved that inflict, reward, or rather inflict punishment and mete out rewards. It could also be seen as a form of deontology. Deontology is, in the context of ethics, typically rule deontology, that morality is presented in terms of rules, and following these rules is right. In this case, God would make the rules, and what makes them right is that God commands them. So why do people like divine command theory? Why is it often popular? Well, the first thing is that it obviously provides a definite foundation for ethics. God is the foundation of ethics, and there's your metaphysics, there's your definite basis for good and evil, right or wrong. Also, for those who see God as omnipotent and the sovereign of everything, this seems to be reasonably required. If he's all powerful, then whatever he says is so, and being the ruler of the universe, then whatever he commands would be, well, presumably a legitimate command. And one could contend that it would seem simply implausible, intuitively, to think there could be anything above God or even equal to God. Now, it definitely answers the classic question, why be moral or why be good? Because typically in most, religious-based ethics, a reward for goodness is guaranteed. God sees to it that that always occurs, and the punishment for being evil is certain. Again, assuming that the theory is correct and that God does exist and he does all these things. And it makes morality objective. God becomes the foundation of morality, and it would be a matter of certainty because what God says is good, and God applies these commands presumably to everyone. Now, of course, there could be finer details that would need to be worked out, but that's kind of the basics of divine command theory. And again, in terms of its appeals, it provides that foundation for ethics. It seems to be required by God's sovereignty and omnipotence. And again, it answers the question, why be moral, and makes ethics, clearly objective. Now, as our example of a divine command theorist, we'll look at our good dead friend, John Dunn Scotus. Little background for him. He was born in 1266 in Scotland, died in 1308, and is still dead today. He was in the Franciscan order. He studied at both Oxford and Paris, and Lexford at Oxford, Paris, and Cologne. Now, he's a philosopher that you've heard of, kind of, but probably don't know you've kind of heard of him, and this is why. When he was, alive and presenting his philosophical views, he had many followers, and they were called duncemen, or, and this is where you probably heard of him, dunces. Yes, those dunces. Now, so why would the followers of John Dunn Scotus, being called dunces, how would that become now an insult, to mean like someone who's dull and ignorant? Well, here's why. During the Renaissance, the humanists then regarded the duncemen, the dunces, and their scholasticism, and this was a school of philosophical and academic thought, they were seen by the Renaissance humanists as barriers to intellectual enlightenment. And so they were regarded as dull and ignorant. And so this term from the Renaissance, referring to, the followers of John Duns Scotus, became a insulting term that's still in the language today. As a matter that's entirely coincidental, Scotus, Scotus, is also a common abbreviation for the Supreme Court of the United States, sometimes. But no connection there, unless one is into conspiracy theories. So what is his view? Well, what sort of informs his view is his look, his perception of how God's will, intellect, and morality, interact, come together. Now, when we looked at our good dead friend St. Thomas Aquinas, he was an intellectualist, and not in the sense of being like really smart and listening to NPR and that kind of stuff, but in terms of he regarded the intellect as the higher aspect of the soul, and in the case of God, the idea was that God's intellect essentially guided his will. So he'd only will what was possible. He wouldn't do the impossible. Now, Scotus is a voluntarist. Again, not in the sense that he volunteered for a lot of stuff, but in the sense that he regarded God's will as the higher and more noble aspect of the soul in general. In the case of God, his will, in a sense, was, one could put it as greater than the intellect. So he could will anything, even the impossible, and his omnipotence would make it so. So again, it's a view about God's will and intellect and omnipotence. What is it to be all-powerful? And for Aquinas, God being all-powerful meant that God could do anything that would be possible. And for Scotus, God could do anything. He's not limited by the intellect. So how did Scotus argue for the will? Well, he gave the following argument. He notes that knowledge is an instrument of the will. And so the intellect, in a way, is kind of like an assistant or servant that brings to the will information and alternatives. And then, like a sovereign or a ruler, the will chooses between them, or as he sees it. So he also notes that the will can move the intellect. You get to choose, typically, what you'll think about. Now, he also embraces the idea that the will is free, and he contends that the will cannot be determined by anything, even the intellect. Now, going along with this, there's a important distinction between Aquinas' view and Scotus' view. Aquinas, who is heavily influenced by Aristotle, held to the view that many Greek philosophers held, that we necessarily will what we regard as the highest good. This goes back to at least Socrates, in his view that to know the good essentially is to will the good, and evil is a matter of ignorance. So Aquinas was heavily influenced by Aristotle and that particular Greek view of willing. Now, Scotus takes an opposing viewpoint. He claims that the will is not determined by knowledge of the good, but chooses the good only as the result of a free decision. So for Aquinas, we simply will what we think is good, although we can be mistaken. In the case of Scotus, we can choose the good, but this is a result of a free decision. We wouldn't like auto choose what we think of as being the highest good. He also continues in his reasoning that the intellect is determined by the object of knowledge, whereas the will itself can simply accept or reject what is before it. So it has a superior power. And he notes that the total cause of willing, he says, is in the will itself. So he places the will as ascendant over the intellect. So as I noted, John Duns Scotus, voluntarist, and a bit more about what this entails and involves. So Aquinas, as we saw when we looked at him, he held that morality in the natural world, this imperfect world, was based on a natural inclination to seek happiness. And again, he's essentially building it based on Aristotle's view, and then he adds like the Christian layer on top of that. Scotus takes the view that morality might require you to take actions that impede or interfere with your own happiness. And again, with Aquinas, he's essentially takes it from Aristotle that being good leads to happiness, but Scotus takes the view that being good may make you very unhappy. So why is this? Well, for Scotus, our moral obligations depend only on God's commands and not on our happiness. Now, Aquinas also held, stealing from Aristotle, that moral law could be found by studying our nature. Because in terms of the natural morality for this imperfect world, you can find that by examining, what are humans, and then you determine what it is to be an excellent human, and that would give you a guide to the moral law in the here and now. Now, Scotus, being consistent, holds to voluntarism and claimed there's no natural way to determine moral truths. You can't look at human nature and then infer moral truths. And this is because, again, of his view of voluntarism. So, for Scotus, God's actions are determined by his will, not his reason. And this is because, according to Scotus, God is both free and omnipotent. That is, his power allows him to do anything, and he is free, so he can do anything, literally anything, presumably even the impossible. So because of this, according to Scotus at least, since reason cannot know God's purposes, reason can also not infer God's actions via a priori means. Now, in the context of philosophy, a priori means, obviously means like prior, but in this case it means prior to experience. And so to know something a priori is to know it prior to sensory experience, and typically in terms of knowing it through pure reason, that you could just kind of sit down and think about it and know the answer. Now, a non-controversial example of an a priori truth that we can know would be something like this. So suppose right now I say I'm drawing a triangle and you can't see it. And I ask, how many sides does this triangle have? Now you can't see what I've drawn, but you naturally would say that the triangle has 3 sides, and that's because you know, by pure reason, without looking, that triangles by definition have 3 sides. Now philosophers disagree quite a bit about what kind of things you can know a priori, by pure reason, and one of the big divisions in philosophy is between the rationalists, who believe you can know things about the world, at least some things, by pure reason. Interestingly, what they often claim you can know about the world is that God exists. And then there are empiricists who claim you can't know anything about the world except through empirical means, what is called a posteriori knowledge. And so the way Scotus reasons is that given God is utterly free, not limited by his will, which include not being limited by like logic and mathematics and stuff, and that God is all powerful, we can have no idea what God would do by pure reason. We couldn't sit down and reason this out. This is because everything is contingent upon God's will. He could literally do anything, will anything, and make it happen. Now, because of this, there's no rational necessity to the world, and presumably everything could have been otherwise. Now, this, of course, takes us into some big metaphysical issues about the nature of the world, what you can know about it, things like possibility and necessity. And so one of the debates in philosophy of religion is whether God is free like this, and God could do anything, the world could totally be otherwise, because God's will is supreme over his intellect and he's omnipotent. And there are other thinkers who take the view that because of God's intellect, he must do what he does because he is what he is, roughly speaking. That he could not do otherwise, not because he's constrained or forced by anything outside of himself, but because he is a perfect being, and he must do what he does because he is what he is. There's nothing else that he could do. Thinkers like Spinoza, Benedict Spinoza, probably the best example of this. And so even though this is a big metaphysical debate, namely, must God do what he does because he is what he is, or can God do anything, it does have these implications for ethics. Because if Scotus is right, and God could do anything, the world could be any way, literally any way. Everything could be otherwise. Things could be radically different than what we think they are, and in effect, reason is almost useless in sorting things out. So in terms of his main argument for voluntarism, here's how he reasons. So if God's choices were logically necessary, that means that God has to do what he does because he is what he is. And this view is argued again by Spinoza and other thinkers, that because, God is perfect and he is what he is, then God simply must do what God does. So Scotus reasons that if God's choices were logically necessary, then the details of the world could be determined by reason, like with a geometric proof. And this is something that other thinkers explicitly did. Again, Spinoza believed that at least, a being with enough intellect could sort these things out. And the notion of that the world must be as it is, because, God must be what God is, he does what he does because he is what he is, they could sort these things out, geometrically. Our good dead friend Descartes, for example, believed you could make deductive inferences about the world, this kind of thing, sorting stuff out in this manner. And our good dead friend Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz also argued about God and mathematics and stuff, similar view. Now, Scotus reasons that, again, if God's choices were logically necessary, that is to say he had to do what he does because he is what he is, and he wasn't free and all-powerful to do what he wanted, then we could determine, the nature of the world deductively. But Scotus says we cannot do this. So he infers, so God was free in his act of creation, and the created world is utterly contingent. It can be any way that God wants it to be. He could will any world. Now, if you're interested in seeing sort of a contrasting view, I would recommend Spinoza, our good dead friend, and also Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who famously argued that God, because God is good and all-knowing and all-powerful, he knew all the worlds that he could create, so all-knowing. Being all good, he picks the best one, and being all-powerful, he made it so. And Leibniz was writing after Scotus, so Leibniz is explicitly rejecting Dunn's Scotus. So, are there any moral laws that are intrinsic? Well, Scotus does say that there is one law that's, based on intrinsic good, and that's the command to love God. And that law is supposedly the only thing that God could not do otherwise. Everything else, according to Dunn's Scotus, would be good or bad based on God's commands, either commanding us to do it or forbidding us from doing so. So let's take a look at the Ten Commandments from the standpoint of John Duns Scotus. So according to Scotus, given this is kind of, in a way this might seem like inconsistent, but it's kind of an exception to, the rule. So Scotus claimed that the first set of commandments, the Ten Commandments, would be rationally necessary moral truths. So this would be like the exception. So first would be, have no other gods than the one true God. Secondly, not make any graven images. Third, not take the Lord's name in vain. And lastly, to keep the Sabbath holy. So why must these apply? Well, according to Scotus, these commands fall from God's love of himself, and it would be self-contradictory for him not to make these commands. And if there is a natural law, contrary to Aristotle, or rather Aquinas, Scotus says it exists in those 4 commandments. So what about the other 6 commandments? Well, according to John Dunn Scotus, these other commandments are the result of God's will and are not rationally necessary. We should obey them because God commands them, and God could, of course, commanded their opposite. So, in a way, again, it does seem a bit consistent because those 4 commandments are rationally necessary, God could not do otherwise, and then everything else is up to God's will. Now, a critic could say that if Scotus was being truly consistent, then nothing. To say that these commandments are rationally necessary moral truths would be a mistake, and that everything would be up for grabs, that God could, have commanded that people do make graven images, etc. But Scotus thinks that because of his conception of God, that those have to be rationally necessary moral truths. And so that's a version of divine command theory presented by John Dunn Scotus.